In this video, I'm going to teach you about 3 methods of persuasion, when to use each method, and which method is most likely to produce behavior change that really lasts. Hi everybody, I'm Bruce Lambert from HowCommunicationWorks.com. This is a channel where I teach you about communication skills so you can improve your relationships, succeed at work, and be more confident. One of the most important functions of communication, or tasks in communication, is persuasion, which is normally thought of as the science of attitude change or behavior change, how we use communication to change people's attitudes and behaviors. But one question that we might ask ourselves when we engage in persuasion is, what kind of change are we really producing in the person that we're persuading? Is it a superficial change that will go away maybe as soon as we go away? Or is it a lasting change that will endure long after we're gone and long after our message is forgotten? Imagine that the behavior that we're trying to change is safe driving. We want people to wear their seatbelts and not run through red lights. Well, we can imagine a bunch of different ways of trying to influence people to drive safely and by wearing their seatbelts and not running through red lights. So we could put cameras up, these red light cameras. I don't know if you live in a state where they have these red light cameras. In Illinois, we have them. So if you do run through a red light, it takes a picture of your license plate and you get a letter in the mail with a $100 ticket for running through a red light. So that's one way we could persuade people not to run through red lights. We'll say, we'll be watching you, and if you do run through a red light, we're going to punish you with a $100 fine. A second way we might do it is we might hire a famous celebrity, an athlete or a movie star or a TV star or a musician or something like that, and they could say, safe driving is important, friends. I always drive safely. I always put on my seatbelt and I always stop at a red light. So if you want to be like me, you should drive safely too. And the third way that we might do it is we might try rational persuasion. We might say, when you stop at red lights, 50% fewer accidents happen. And when you wear your seatbelt, you're 67% less likely to be injured in an accident. And we might try to persuade people in that way. So these 3 examples represent 3 different mechanisms of influence that I want to talk about today. Each of them can be effective, and if you think about the examples that I gave, you've probably heard these kinds of influence attempts with respect to safe driving. You've probably heard all 3 types, because all 3 types can be effective under different circumstances and for different audiences, but the 3 types produce different kinds of behavior change. In 1958, psychologist Herbert Kellman published an article in which he said there were 3 basic processes of social influence that produced 3 different kinds of behavior change. And he called these processes of social influence compliance, identification, and internalization. And I want to define each of these in turn. The first type of social influence that Herbert Kellman talked about, he called compliance. This is the form of influence we accept in order to avoid punishments or get rewards. And this is the kind of influence we accept normally when we're under surveillance, when someone is watching our behavior. So the classic example of this is when we stop at a red light because there's a red light camera there. It's not necessarily that we believe that stopping at red lights is the best idea or that driving safely is the best idea. It's not that we want to be like somebody else who drives because our mom stops at red lights. We want to stop at red lights too. No, we stop at red lights because there's a camera there. And if we don't stop, we're going to get a ticket. So that's compliance. That is accepting influence in order to avoid a punishment in this case, but sometimes you can accept influence because you're going to get a reward. So sometimes we can get people to do things, we can get children to do things by promising them rewards, even though they don't necessarily believe in the underlying behavior and their attitudes don't really change. It's just that when you're watching them, and if they're going to get a reward or a punishment, they'll do the behavior. That's compliance. The second type of influence is called identification. And this is when we accept influence because we want to be like someone who's trying to influence us. So the classic example of this in my mind is the old Gatorade commercial from the 1990s. It might have even been from the 80s. About be like Mike. I want to be like Mike. And they're talking about Michael Jordan, the Hall of Fame basketball player. And since I'm from Chicago, he was one of my heroes, and I remember this commercial very well. I'm going to stop right now and play you a clip of that commercial because it's so awesome.
Sometimes I dream that heals me. Got to see that's how I dream to be.
I dream I move,
I move.
I dream I groove, like Mike. If I could be like Mike,
I wanna be like Mike.
like Mike. If I could be like Mike,
Be like Mike.
Be like Mike.
Oh,
Be like Mike.
yeah, I try. Just need to fly.
Just one day if I could be that way. I dream I move.
Dream I groove, like Mike. If I could be like Mike,
I wanna be like Mike.
like Mike. If I could be like Mike,
Oh, be like Mike.
like Mike. If I could be like Mike.
So that is the classic example of identification. Be like Mike. Drink Gatorade. That's what the message says. It's no more ambiguous than that. They just come right out and say, if you drink Gatorade, you're going to be like Mike because Mike drinks Gatorade. And of course, this sold a lot of Gatorade because people desperately wanted to be like Mike. And the same thing works now with the Kardashians or Rihanna. I just heard Rihanna signed a contract with Louis Vuitton to sell, luggage and cosmetics and stuff like that because people want to be like Rihanna and they'll buy the same products that she wears because of this process of identification. So in this case, we don't necessarily believe that Gatorade is the best tasting drink. Nobody really believes Gatorade tastes that good, I don't think. But we wanted to be like Mike. So it's not really the content of the message that we believe. It's not really consistent with our beliefs and values, but we'll accept influence because we want to be like the person who's doing the influence or be like someone that the behavior is associated with. And this is why celebrity endorsements work so well, because we want to be like celebrities or we want to have lives like theirs. And so we'll use the products that they endorse. So this kind of influence is only effective when the relationship is salient or relevant. That is when we feel the salience of that relationship. That's when we're amenable to influence in terms of identification. Just like we're amenable to influence in terms of compliance if we're under surveillance, identification works when the relationship with this other person is relevant. Then we can be persuaded. So I see Michael Jordan and think, oh man, he could get me to buy anything that he does. I'll buy Nike shoes. I'll drink Gatorade because I want to be like Mike. So that's identification. The third mechanism of influence is called internalization. And this is where we accept influence because the behavior or the attitude is consistent with our own values. And the reward that we get is not to be like Mike or to avoid a punishment or get a reward, but it's because it's intrinsically satisfying to us. The behavior that we're adopting or the attitude that we're adopting is consistent with our own values. And after sort of rational deliberation, we have decided to internalize this attitude or this behavior and make it our own because we're happy with it being part of us. So this, an example of internalization is really any time that we accept influence as the result of rational persuasion, when someone makes arguments and gives evidence and produces statistics, and we review those evidence and that evidence and those statistics, and we come to the conclusion that yes, I accept these arguments. They are consistent with my beliefs. I accept the reasoning. I accept the evidence as valid. I accept the speaker or the persuader as someone with credibility, that is, who has expertise and who's telling me the truth. And therefore, I'm going to change my attitude or my behavior as a result. So in terms of the driving safely example, it might be that we read a newspaper article or a blog post or something, and we see something, a documentary that talks about how dangerous driving leads to all sorts of deaths and accidents and disabilities and carnage, and safe driving, saves lives and saves money and saves heartache and so on. And so we internalize this value and these behaviors as our own because we've been rationally persuaded. That's internalization. The thing about internalization that's interesting is that we will enact the behavior whenever the issue is relevant. So what that means is that, like if I adopt safe driving through the process of internalization, by internalizing that attitude, making it part of my own framework of attitudes and beliefs, then I will drive safely all the time. I will stop at every stoplight. But not only when there's a camera there, or not only when I want to be like some celebrity who says I should drive safely, but because I've internalized this attitude or this behavior, I will drive safely all the time. So whenever the issue is relevant, I will produce that attitude or that behavior, which is a big contrast between compliance, when I only comply when I'm under surveillance, or identification, where I only adopt the behavior when the relationship with this important other is relevant to me. These three mechanisms of influence also require different sources of power on the part of the person who's doing the persuasion. So for compliance, the kind of power that the persuader needs is the power to produce rewards and punishments. So the reason that the state, right, or the local municipality has the power to persuade us to stop at red lights is because they have the power to put up these cameras, and they have the power to fine us or take away our license or do these other things. So if you have the power to produce rewards and punishments, then you can use compliance as an effective mechanism of social influence. That's why our bosses, who have control over rewards and punishments at work, can make us comply with rules at work, because they have the power, they have the means to punish us or reward us. And this is often enough to make us comply, even with rules that we don't really believe in. Think of all the rules that you follow at work that you don't really believe in, but you comply with them because you're under surveillance in some way, and the person who's doing the persuading or the influencing has the power to reward you or punish you. So that's the source of power for compliance, the power to reward or punish you. With identification as a mechanism of social influence, the source of power is attractiveness. So anyone who you find attractive has the power to influence you by means of identification. So Michael Jordan, I looked up to him. He was my hero. I thought he was the greatest basketball player ever. I was incredibly attracted to his charisma and his athletic skill and so on. And so I wanted to be like Mike, just like all those millions of other people who drank the Gatorade. So anyone who is attractive to us because of their achievements, because of their physical appearance, because of their wealth, whatever it is, that attraction gives them the power to influence us by means of identification. They know that we want to be like them. They can exploit that power to influence us. And this is the whole sort of mechanism by which the Kardashians can get people to buy anything that they sell, because people want to be like the Kardashians. They want that lifestyle. They want that glamour. And so they can use that attractiveness as a source of power to influence people to do what they want. If you want to use internalization as a mechanism of influence, you have to have credibility. The source of power that lies behind internalization is credibility. Credibility is something I'll make another video about, but in short, it has to do with trustworthiness and expertise. If someone has credibility, it means that we trust that they're going to tell us the truth, and that we think they know what they're talking about. If those two things are true, if they're trustworthy and expert, we grant them credibility. And in order for someone to use internalization as a mechanism of influence, they must have credibility. So this is why we normally use experts to do lots of rational persuasion about health behavior, for example. We get people to say, you must use sunscreen in order to avoid sunburn and skin cancer and so on. And instead of getting a celebrity to do that and use identification, we'll often get a scientist, or we'll get a dermatologist or an oncologist who treats skin cancer to come on, and they use their credibility. They are trustworthy, they are expert, and they use that credibility to rationally persuade us to change our attitudes and our behavior. That's the source of power for internalization, credibility. All three of these techniques are valid social influence techniques. If you're trying to decide which technique to use, you should examine, what sort of power do you have? Are you extremely attractive to your audience? Then you might want to use identification. Do you have the power over rewards and punishments? You might want to use compliance. Are you capable of setting up surveillance to make sure people comply with the behavior? Then you might want to use compliance as the mechanism of influence. Do you have tremendous credibility and a lot of arguments and evidence on your side? Then you might want to use internalization. All of these social influence techniques are actively used in the real world. You can look out all around you. You could just turn on the television or the radio or browse the internet, and you'll see all three kinds of appeals being used all the time to sell different products and different ideas. All three techniques can be effective. I would say that in some sense, internalization is the most effective technique only because it produces the most lasting behavior change. So let's say we want people to drive safely, or we want people to, eat less meat or something like that, become vegans or become vegetarians. Well, let's say we want people to become vegans or vegetarians. Well, if you can keep them under surveillance all the time and threaten them with punishment when they eat meat or anything non-vegan, you can try to use compliance, but that doesn't seem very likely. Or you can get, a beautiful movie star to say, I'm a vegetarian, I'm a vegan, you should be like me. But the problem with both of those techniques is as soon as a person's not under surveillance, they're going to eat bacon. Or as soon as the thought of that movie star is out of their mind, they're going to have a big steak. But if you persuade somebody by means of internalization, then you don't need surveillance. You don't need the relevance of the relationship. You don't have to have people thinking about some celebrity. But whenever they eat, because they've been persuaded by these arguments and they've internalized them as part of their own belief system, they will not eat meat. Whenever they eat at all, their thoughts about veganism or vegetarian will be relevant. And since they've been persuaded by this mechanism of internalization, those attitudes will come up and they will decide not to eat meat. So that's what I think the advantage of internalization is. But it's difficult. You have to have credibility. You have to have the arguments on your side. And a lot of times, people are not necessarily that amenable to rational persuasion. You can just look at the world around you, look at politics, look at a lot of different issues that we face in the world, and you can see that rational persuasion does not always work. And that's why we see the frequent use of these other mechanisms of influence, namely compliance and identification. In fact, it's possible to use all three techniques on the same issue, really on the same group of people. In fact, this is done a lot. So think of something like cigarette smoking. Insurance companies and our employers and anyone who might have to pay for our healthcare, they really don't want us to smoke cigarettes. They often use a form of compliance influence because insurance companies and our employers have the power to offer rewards and punishments in the form of higher insurance premiums or lower insurance premiums if we do or we don't smoke. And they can test our blood or our urine to see if we've been smoking cigarettes. So that's surveillance, and you can give rewards and punishments in the form of higher or lower insurance premiums. So you can use compliance as a mechanism of influence to discourage people from smoking. You can also use identification. You can get a famous celebrity or a famous athlete to talk about how they quit smoking and how smoking is an unattractive habit. And they can use that power of their attractiveness. People will want to be like them. They'll say, oh, I love that celebrity. I admire that athlete so much. I want to be like them. And they don't smoke, so I should stop smoking too. And at the same time, you can offer rational arguments. You can say smoking causes lung cancer and kidney cancer and bladder cancer and colon cancer, and it causes heart disease and it causes strokes and so on. And you can give people all sorts of statistics, and it costs a lot of money, and it makes you smell bad. And you can get a credible scientist or a public health expert to talk about those arguments. And in fact, we do all three of these things. Smoking is such a big public health problem that we try all three mechanisms of social influence to produce the kinds of behavior change that we're looking for. So that's it. A famous article by Herbert Kellman about three mechanisms of social influence: compliance, identification, and internalization. The article, hard to believe, written in 1958, still extremely relevant even today. And these mechanisms of social influence still being used all the time, all around us, everywhere we look. Question of the day. Where in your life are you accepting influence in the form of compliance, identification, or internalization? Go down in the comments and leave me a comment below about where you're accepting influence in one form or another. If you like this kind of video, I'd be so grateful if you would consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video, sharing it with a friend. If you do click that subscribe button, make sure to hit the bell icon so YouTube lets you know next time we upload a video. If you like to learn about communication skills, we also have a website called howcommunicationworks.com where I blog about communication skills. You can find links to lots of other YouTube videos as well as links to many long-form articles I've written about communication skills. If you go over there and you give us your email address, we'll send you an ebook about empathy, which I think you'll find to be useful and interesting. Thanks so much for watching. I'm grateful for your time. We'll see you next time.